But anyway, welcome to the LSE and welcome to the Maurice Fraser Annual Lecture for 2024. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, I'd like to say a word about Maurice. Maurice, having served as a special advisor to no fewer than 3 British foreign secretaries between 1989 and 1995, and my word, think about those dates, 1989 to 1995, to be working in the British Foreign Office with the wall coming down, and then later with Maastricht on the table. What a period to be working there. In 1995, though, Maurice left the working with the British Foreign Secretaries and came back to the LSE, where he had in fact been a student, and he came to teach in what was then the more or less recently formed European Institute. And he was my friend. My book on Europe, A Philosophical History, is into his memory. It says, I'm terrible at this sort of thing. This volume is dedicated to my friend and colleague Maurice Fraser, with whom I taught a course called The Idea of Europe for over a decade at the LSE. Very sadly, Maurice died while I was completing the first draft of this text, and I'm very sorry that I won't get to hear his warm and generous praise for getting it published and his robust and unstinting criticism for everything I've written. That was Maurice. He became head of the European Institute in 2013, although he had to step down in 2015 from ill health, and he died in 2016. And I'm very pleased to see his family here too tonight, and I know that Maurice would have been excited as I am to hear tonight's lecture. Our guest today is Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies and the Isaiah Berlin Fellow Emeritus at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. He made a career that straddled academic history, specializing in something I guess he more or less invented called history of the present, straddled that with journalism, and Timothy came to know more European and world leaders than those leaders themselves knew. In a period when Henry Kissinger would ask, who do I call if I want to call Europe? A very good answer would have been, call Timothy Garton Ash. And who better to ask today about Europe's heading? Taking off from the research from his latest book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, which incidentally is now for sale in paperback outside this room after the lecture, where there will also be a wine reception, so you can both buy the book and get a free drink. And taking off from that work, he'll be talking today to the provocative title, Europe at the Beginning of a New Era. Please give a warm welcome to Timothy Garton Ash.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's lovely to be here. And I see my neck is going to get quite a lot of practice in the course of this evening. By the way, Kissinger claimed to have said, you say Europe, but which number should I call? There is absolutely no evidence that he ever actually said this. And I once wrote to him and said, we can't find any evidence you ever said it. Where did you say it? And he wrote a letter back which began, I think I must have said it in around 1973. It's a great pleasure to give the Maurice Fraser Memorial Lecture. Maurice was a friend. He was a hugely distinguished director of this institute. He was not just a pro-European, but actually a European, speaking fluent French, knowing Europe intimately. That's an important difference. There have been a lot of people who are very British pro-Europeans, but not really Europeans. Roy Jenkins, for example, would be a good example. And last but not least, he was a British conservative European, a breed now almost as rare as the Amsterdam albatross or the giant yellow croaker. So it's wonderful to be speaking in his memory. I'm going to start with one point from my book, Homelands, and then say no more about it, because as Simon said, it's available to purchase afterwards at a knockdown price, and since you're all going to be buying it, I don't need to say any more about it. But the framing of this book, which is a personal history of Europe, is that we have lived through two distinct periods of European history since 1945. There is the period post-1945, conventionally called the post-war period, and then there is what I call the post-wall period, the period that begins with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 and ends on the 24th of February 2022 with Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Post-war and then post-war. Hence the claim that we are at the beginning of a new period. Now, of course, traditional historians would say, how can you possibly say that? It's much too soon to say. But let me leave the claim on the table and say that at least I think we can agree that many of the shared assumptions of Europeans through the post-war period from 1989 to 2022 have now been blown out of the water and no longer apply, okay? And because I'm not a conventional historian, but a historian of the present, I'm now going to invite you in the next 35, 40 minutes to think aloud with me from the left and from the right, however you like to look at it, about the characteristics, what may be the characteristics of this new period, and some of the explanations for them, and then briefly towards the end, what we might do about it. And I'm going to identify 7 interconnected features which I think may be seen to distinguish this new period, given the obvious caveat that it's too soon to say. The first is the most obvious one, the return of war. Not just of small wars, because of course we had the wars in former Yugoslavia, which though brutal were very contained, but of major interstate war. Which has now been going on for, soon it'll be 1,000 days, the largest war in Europe since 1945. If you add up the estimated casualties, killed and wounded, military and civilian, we're close to 1 million people, 1 million people killed. It's hard to overemphasize how much we lived post-45, but particularly post-89, with the sense that this was a Europe in which major wars were a thing of the past, right? So Tony Judd's famous book, Post-War, which many of you will know, the title had a double meaning. It meant not just conventionally post-1945, it also meant a Europe which had put war behind it. In 2008, the date is significant, the very distinguished historian James Sheehan wrote a book about Europe called Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? Allusion to Marlene Dietrich. And the question of the book was, as we know from Charles Tilly, war created the European state, and then the states made war. But how is it that Europe is now the first continent on which you have what he called civilian states? Well, it's not looking that way now. Poland's defense spending is currently upwards of 4.5% of GDP, heading towards 5% of GDP. In several European countries, including Germany, there is a discussion about reintroducing conscription. And what is more, it's not just the military dimension that has come back in spades, but also nuclear weapons, which had virtually disappeared from the intra-European conversation in the post-war period. 4 weeks ago, I was in Kharkiv, the Ukrainian city close to the Russian, very close to the Russian frontier. And as I was saying goodbye to one of the leading activists, her parting shot was, by the way, I'm volunteering to head the Ukrainian nuclear weapons program. It was half a joke, but only half a joke. Ukraine is one of the very few countries in the world which voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 for security assurances from the US, Russia, and this country, the UK. And look what happened. It got hammered. And actually, Zelensky, too, when he was in Brussels the other day, said, look, basically, we have two choices. Either we get NATO or we get nukes, or we at least go for nukes. And so the subject, and by the way, the Chinese analysis of the war in Ukraine, one of the interesting points in that analysis is their conclusion is nuclear blackmail works. Putin has been very successful in deterring the West for fear of escalation to the use of nuclear weapons. So the question of how the Ukraine war ends is going to be crucial for the future security state. And of course, this is not even to mention, which I must in passing, the terrible wars in the Middle East and their impact on Europe. My second suggestion for a characteristic is closely related to this. This is likely to be the period in which US interest in and commitment to Europe, and particularly to European security, continues to decline, either dramatically under Donald Trump, but also, let's have no illusions, significantly on a secular trend under Harris administration. Now, this is a trend that began already after the end of the Cold War. One of the stories I tell in the book is of being summoned to brief George W. Bush before his first official visit to Europe in 2001, May 2001. It's a small group of people who were invited to brief him. And one of the questions he asked us, I've never forgotten, was, do we want the European Union to succeed? Now, a US president before the end of the Cold War would not have asked that question, right? Because it was self-evident that a strong Western Europe would be in the national interest of the United States in the context of the Cold War. But ever since the question has been posed, it was posed under Obama. It's not just Trump by any means. Biden, to some extent, has been an exception. So whichever president emerges, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that after 80 years in which, to an extraordinary degree, Europe did depend on the United States for its security. The Americans say the US was Europe's pacifier. Now, those of you who know American English, I'm told that's American for a baby's dummy, right? But it's true. And we're going to have to reckon with a Europe in which that is, in the best case, much less certain. The third characteristic I would put to you for discussion is that the economic, social, and political consequences of the post-war period are that political liberalism and liberal democracy has been significantly compromised by its extremely close relationship with what I'm going to call globalized, financialized capitalism. Okay, so you can say neoliberalism if you like, but actually it's not about the ideology. It's about the reality of a capitalism. Jürgen Kocher, the German historian, in his book on capitalism is very good on this, which is at once unprecedentedly globalized and financialized. And it's a connection between the globalization and financialization which is crucial. A figure I get from John Lanchester, and I assume this applies is for 2023. According to Lanchester, the value of all the economic activity in the world is somewhere in the order of $105 trillion. The value of the financial derivatives off the back of that economic or related to that economic activity, by his account, is, wait for it, $667 trillion. So the combination of globalization and financialization. What's the consequences of that? What have they been? It plunged us into the global financial crisis of 2008 with so many consequences. In my book, 2008 is the turning point in the post-war period, Eurozone crisis, the great austerity. It catalyzed a kind of revolutionary change in many people's life experiences. It actually came close to being what Karl Marx famously envisaged as the impact of capitalism in the Communist Manifesto, in that famous passage which some of you will know. I quote, "All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All newly formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air." Add to that the revolution in communications, in shorthand, the internet, which has the same effect in the information space, and you get a change much more revolutionary than anything that happened under communism in Eastern Europe. Capitalism is the most revolutionary force, not communism. And to that, you get a reaction, quite a strong reaction. So a good deal of what you can see in our societies can be understood as simply a reaction. Too much change, too fast for me. I don't recognize my country anymore. Mary Shelley says, quote, "Nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change," right? So reaction leads you to reactionary. Inequality, not seen for 100 years, economic but also cultural, because it's also inequality in access to education. The economists have a wonderful phrase, hereditary meritocracy. Hereditary meritocracy. I would think not a few people who study at Oxford or the LSE might be considered children of a hereditary meritocracy. We too. And then the fact that you get trans and supranational monopolies, the big tech companies, and something very close to plutocracy, I would argue. I would argue that in the developed Western capitalist democracies, we have at the very least highly developed plutocratic tendencies. Martin Wolf, in his book on democratic capitalism, says the problem is that the genius of liberal democracy was that it separated wealth and power. For most of human history, wealth and power went together, separated. And as I think Martin rightly argues, the trouble is that now they're converging again in this plutocratic version. Of course, most pronounced in the United States, Trump himself, Elon Musk is an obvious example, Jeff Bezos, most recently, telling the Washington Post that it can't back a candidate even against Donald Trump. Actually, the pioneer of this was a European. Some of you may remember him, Silvio Berlusconi. Silvio Berlusconi was in a way the pioneer of this kind of plutocratic version of democratic capitalism. Rupert Murdoch in our own country, after all, we live in a country where, I'm sorry to have to say this, you can effectively buy a seat in Parliament. That's not some banana republic somewhere. That's Britain. I don't want to be sued, so I won't mention any names, but it is clearly the case that major party donors have miraculously ended up in the House of Lords. Before we even get to someone like Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, right? The billionaire who starts as a very successful businessman, and then funds a whole party and becomes prime minister off the back of that and owns the media to support the party, and Mr. Ivanishvili in Georgia. Final effect of this globalized, financialized capitalism is, in a sense, a positive one, because the case for it is that it lifted hundreds of millions of people in India and China out of poverty. It enabled extraordinary levels of economic development in other parts of the world, right? India and China being the most notable. I was about 22, 23 years ago, I was in Beijing, and the National Museum, some of you may remember the History of the World in 100 Objects. Do you remember that wonderful Neil McGregor exhibition? So they'd got the History of the World in 100 Objects, but they'd added one object, 101. Anyone like to guess what it was? You'll never guess. It was a rather undistinguished looking plastic biro with which the Chinese minister had signed China into the WTO, right? They recognized just how important it was to them. But the unintended consequence of this, great growth outside the West, and particularly in Asia, is, of course, the shift in power, the rising power of the non-West, which I'll come back to. Fourth characteristic, fourth of the seven, is very obviously the continued growth of a hard-right, nationalist, populist politics, which it begins not to be hyperbole to describe as fascist, right? Now, I actually don't think it's politically clever to label your opponents as fascists. I don't think it's very effective. But certainly, Giorgia Meloni came into politics through, this is just a historical fact, a post-neo-fascist party. And Björn Höcke, the leader of the AfD in Thuringia, which has restored an extraordinary electoral success, well, a German court has said that it's okay to describe him as on the far right and associate him. So the growth of these parties, the shifting of the Overton window of what is acceptable in public discourse, and the collapse of what long held, which was the cordon sanitaire between center-right parties and parties what I'm going to call the hard right. Okay? So that very important cordon sanitaire held for a long time. It's now breaking down. PP and Vox in Spain, gone. Les Républicains and Rassemblement National, well, a bit of Les Républicains has splintered off to get into bed with Rassemblement National, and actually Michel Barnier's government, in a sense, depends upon toleration from Marine Le Pen. In this country, the Tories and Reform. I mean, if we look at the two candidates for conservative leadership, the Netherlands, they're in coalition. Italy, they're in coalition. And this is particularly important for Europe because it's important to remember that historically, it was Christian Democrats, the center-right, who were the party of Europe, the party of European integration, the party for the European Union. By the way, in this country too, people forget it wasn't Labour that took us in to the EEC. It was Maurice's party. And from basically the 1960s until well into the 1980s, it was the Conservatives who were the pro-European party and Labour the Eurosceptic party. It was only subsequently in late 80s, 90s that it switched. So the erosion of center-right parties has really important implications for the European project. And coming along with this is what I'm going to call soft nationalism. So if we have hard nationalism from the parties of the hard right, there's increasingly a soft nationalism in which European governments are prepared to push their national interests in ways they wouldn't have done at least so explicitly. At least so explicitly. Of course, countries always pursue their national interest. I wrote a book called In Europe's Name, which is about German Ostpolitik. But, for example, Germany voting against the EU tariffs on Chinese electronic EVs, knowing that France is going to vote for it, that's soft nationalism. Donald Tusk in Poland saying, we're going to close our frontiers. We're not going to accept refugee applications, asylum applications for a certain period of time, and Europe is certainly not going to stop us. That's soft nationalism. In the French election, it was very striking how the rhetoric turned away from Europe back to themes of nation and sovereignty. And what I think we can already say with a fair degree of confidence is that the politics of preemptive accommodation by parties of the center-right who try to steal the clothes of the hard right don't work. My colleague at Oxford, Tariq Abu-Chadi, has done actually serious political science work on this. Actually, they have the opposite effect. Because people say, why should I listen to the dog whistle when I could have the real dog? And so they go the other way. Fifth feature, very briefly, climate change. Already we have lived through a 12-month period in which global average temperatures were more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the intended ceiling has already been broken through. And this has now become a theme of hard right populist politics, which was not the case a few years ago. Immigration, lifestyle, LGBTQ, and anti-green. Combating the green agenda is an explicit theme on which these parties are gathering votes. Six, going even broader, I think the question is really now posed whether Europe, the European Union, is going more in the direction of integration or more of disintegration. I would say that in this period, the centripetal and the centrifugal forces are in rather fine balance, and it's not at all clear which way it's going to go. There are still strong integrative forces. We have a strong European Commission. We have a strong president of the Commission. The centre has hold in the European Parliament. We have new areas of European cooperation, like defence. But on the other hand, we have Brexit. We have all the politics I've been talking about. And in particular, we have a country like Hungary, which is a country that is no longer a democracy. It's what political scientists call a competitive authoritarian regime, but it's still a full member of the EU and getting the money. So it seems to me that at the beginning of this period, this absolutely fundamental question of whether we're going more towards integration or disintegration is actually posed. And in a way, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because what we have here is a European order which now is about 80 years old. because the peculiarity of 1989 was that instead of having a sort of fundamental change of European order, which was, of course, debated at the time, 1989, 1990, all sorts of alternatives were debated. European Confederation, OSCE to organize European security. No, what happened was that the two core institutions of the Euro-Atlantic West, NATO and the EU, were extended to the East. So it was an extension of the existing post-45 order. And what happens with European orders, we know this from history, is that as time goes by, stresses and strains accumulate within them, both domestically and between countries. And so in a sense, that's what we see happening here. But in this case, it happens in a really transformed global context. And this is my seventh and final characteristic, and then I'll come very briefly to the question of what is to be done. So if you remember, I had two post-W terms, post-war and post-wall. So what's this period going to be called? Well, of course, it's too soon to say, we know that. But I'll tell you one candidate for a possible name for this new period is another post-W, post-Western, right? Post-Western. Now, this is not a consequence of the war in Ukraine or the wars in the Middle East, but it has been revealed by those wars, and particularly by the war in Ukraine. When I say post-Western, I do not mean that the West no longer exists, because in important senses it still does. I do not mean that the West is no longer rich and powerful, because it is still very rich and powerful, probably the biggest still coherent bloc of the rich and the free. I mean that it can no longer call the shots, it can no longer set the agenda of world politics in the way that it was accustomed to do, particularly in the first half of the post-war period, so the 1990s and the 2000s. And this is what the war in Ukraine has revealed. Unprecedented Western unity over Ukraine. Macron has said NATO was brain dead. Well, for someone who was brain dead, it looked pretty alive and kicking. Sweden and Finland join it. Unprecedented sanctions against Ukraine, right? We threw the kitchen sink at them. We did pretty much most of what the West could do. And the Russian economy is growing faster than ours and many other European economies. Why? Because you have the rest. Because you have China, whose trade and economic relations with Russia have soared since the invasion. You have India, which is buying the oil that we will no longer sell to them. You have Brazil, you have South Africa. You have multiple countries who are entirely happy to go on having close relations with Russia, even as it is waging what we describe as, I think with good reason, a neo-colonial war, right? In other words, the assemblage of non-Western great and middle powers, now partly as a result of globalization, has sufficient wealth and power to counterbalance the West. That doesn't mean it's a single BRICS bloc, but it means that they can counterbalance. And we have just had an illustration of this a few days ago, the BRICS summit in Kazan, host Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping delighted to come, Narendra Modi preferring that to the Commonwealth. Well, maybe that's not too much of a surprise. President Ramaphosa attending, 36 leaders in all, and the UN General Secretary going to pay court to Vladimir Putin and all the other BRICS country. This really is, in a way, the most fundamental shift, it seems to me, in Europe's position. Europe, which after all set out to explore and colonize the world around 1500, colonized and dominated the world for 2 centuries, from the early 19th century until 1914, dethroned itself, but was still the central theater of world politics between 1945 and 1989 during the war. And then, in the first half of what I call the post-war period, naively believed that we were going to be the model for the rest of the world. Mark Leonard's book of 2005, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. We've teased Mark more than once about that title. But that was the general sense of that time, that we were giving a model of post-national, law-based international governance that other regions would follow. So we believed in the 90s and early 2000s that the world might increasingly look like late 20th century Europe. Actually, the world is increasingly looking like late 19th century Europe, writ large. That is to say, a world of great powers and empires calmly pursuing their national interest, wherever it might take them. I like to say they're Palmerstonian. You remember Lord Palmerston, the great 19th century British Foreign Secretary, Britain has no eternal friends, only eternal interests. Well, that's a pretty good motto for the foreign policy of India or Brazil these days. Okay, so there's the analysis. It's incomplete, of course. There are multiple areas I haven't covered: political economy, technology, the internal workings of the EU. But I put it on the table for discussion. In the last few minutes, I'm just going to give you, in telegraphic style, because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, a few thoughts about what is to be done about it. And with that, then I'll throw it open. I actually have 7. You're going to get just the bullet points. First of all, and now I'm speaking not so much as a historian, but as a spectateur engagé, as an English European liberal. I believe one of the lessons from this period is that liberals need to be more radical. We'll see how radical Rachel Reeves is tomorrow. In really going after those issues of inequality and plutocracy, but also the fear of change and of climate change, in following up some of the really interesting ideas from people like Gabriel Zucman, or indeed coming up from the Harris team, about taxes on billionaires, on unrealized capital gains, and so on. Secondly, I think how the war in Ukraine ends is going to be crucial for the whole character of this next period. As one or two of you will know, I've spent a lot of time on Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. I've been there 6 times since the 24th of February 2022, last month. And I have to tell you, it is going very badly. And at the moment, Ukraine is on a trajectory to lose. And unless we in the West significantly increase our military support and commit by invitation for NATO membership for Ukraine, which is the only way to hard security, Ukraine will have lost this war. And Ukraine will become a defeated, divided, depopulated, demoralized country. Instead of the women and children coming back from Britain and Poland and Germany, the husbands will come out to join the women and children, and a country full of anger against the West. And wanting to have nuclear weapons. Thirdly, European security. It follows logically from what I was saying about the return of war to our continent, combined with the diminishing US commitment, that we have to do much more for our own security, some combination of a strengthened European pillar of NATO and a stronger defense identity for the EU. Fourth, enlargement. Enlargement is the great success story of European integration. Actually, it's the success story of it's the story of European integration. The way this community has gone from 6 members in 1972 all the way up to 28, and then I'm afraid down again 1 to 27. Now we have Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as candidates for EU membership. If you want to find enthusiasm for Europe, don't go to Germany, don't go to France, don't bother, don't go to Belgium, don't go to the Netherlands. Go to Moldova, or go to Georgia, or go to Ukraine. Now, this is an old story, but their European future absolutely hangs in the balance in all 3 cases, right? So in Ukraine, for obvious reasons, but as we've seen both in the election and referendum in Moldova, and even now in Georgia, what we are up against is what I might call a Russian special political operation. If you have a special military operation, a Russian special political operation, which in the case of Moldova consisted simply in massive bribing of voters. And God knows exactly what went on in Georgia. And I think our response to that has been much too weak. If you look at the immediate EU response to what's happened in Georgia, expressions of concern, right? Or even extreme concern. A Turkish human rights activist friend of mine once said to me, I don't mind what you do in Europe, but just one thing, please, don't give us your concern, right? Because the concern alone without anything to back it up isn't worth much. So I think we have to be much stronger in our response and actually understand that it's in our strategic interest to bring these countries towards Europe. Fifth, the big mistake we made in the last enlargements was to have extremely strong conditionality during the accession process and virtually none once a country had become a full member state. And Viktor Orban, who, by the way, started demolishing democracy in Hungary in 2010, 14 years ago, brilliantly exploited this, realizing that actually once you're inside, you can get away with almost anything. So what we have to do is to reconnect the Europe of values and the Europe of money, because otherwise this will itself become a major driver of disintegration, not just in Europe as a whole, but in the EU. If you can have a country which is a full member state of the European Union, which is no longer a democracy, with a competitive authoritarian regime, and can behave in foreign policy pretty much like India or Brazil, during a full-scale war in Ukraine, condemned by all the EU, off to meet with Vladimir Putin, get cheap gas from Vladimir Putin, then off to meet with Xi Jinping, favored target for Chinese investment in Europe, and now just off to Georgia to congratulate the so-called election winner. If a full member state of the EU can both not be a democracy and behave like some sort of multi-aligning India or Brazil, that's very bad news for European unity. 6, we have to recognize that in this larger Europe, particularly having in mind what I said about European security and enlargement, the goal can no longer be defined simply as ever closer union. The golden formula for which Europeans have been looking ever since the end of the Roman Empire is not simply unity. It's the right balance of unity and diversity. That's the key to a successful European order. That's why the Holy Roman Empire was so successful for so long, because it had a mixture of unity and diversity. So, for example, at the moment, one of the key issues with the EU, Europe more broadly, is that our policies, the policies we need are European, but the politics are still national, right? Policies European, politics national. So there's a logical answer to that, which is, okay, let's make the politics European too. Well, worth a try. European Parliament, directly elected European parties. I don't want to understate their contribution, but the politics are still fundamentally national, and we see that again and again. So rather than trying to achieve some sort of rational ideal, which is not achievable in the foreseeable future, what we need to do is to accept that that's how Europe works. It's this mix of unity and diversity, and then see how we can make it work. Very final, number 7, and I've thrown a lot at you, so I hope there'll be a lot of time for discussion. How do we respond to that post-Western world? At the moment, we are still constantly having recourse to the old bipolar framings, right? The West and the rest. The global South, a term that should be banned, I think, from political debate. Some undifferentiated mass of the global South. That is not how these countries see themselves. India, Brazil, China, Russia, of course, and others see themselves as once again great powers, heirs to great civilization, in some cases heirs to great empires. And so we should be treating them as such, right? So rather than some sort of attempt, which in a way is almost implicitly neo-colonial, to win over the global South to our side, or win over the global South, or win over the rest, we need an India policy, a China policy, a Brazil policy, a South African policy, understanding each of them in their own terms as great or middle powers. And we would, I think, get much further with that. A very final thought. This list of bullet points that I've thrown at you could sound rather like a leading article in the FT. My editor at The Guardian, where I write a column, says, we have far too many headlines that contain the word must. We must do something, right? She says, we must stop saying must. And this has been a we must list, right? Now, the politician's fallacy is to confuse must and will, right? I heard Gabriel Attal in Kiev a few weeks ago give one of these great politicians' speeches in which he said, Ukraine must win. Ukraine will win. Will does not follow from must, right? Will does not follow from must. And to be quite honest with you, if you put a pistol to my head and said, what do you think Europe is actually going to do? How much of this is Europe going to do? Not all that much. My hunch would be that we will continue to muddle through as dictated by our national politics, and you will have a period of very slow weakening, of mild disintegration of the European project and the European Union. That would be my hunch. But it's not inevitable, because nothing is inevitable. The mistake we made before 2008 was to believe that the upward progress, the spread of democracy and freedom and European integration would somehow naturally continue because we knew the direction of history, a la Francis Fukuyama, and it was inevitable. Well, the ascent was not inevitable, but by the same token, the descent is not inevitable. It's up to us. It's up to you. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.